Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. We need to talk about books that don't exist, not children's fantasies or simple literary inventions, but texts that occupy a peculiar zone between fiction and something more troubling, grimoires that scholars have requested from university libraries, occult manuals that magicians have attempted to reconstruct, forbidden knowledge so convincingly documented that the boundary between Lovecraft's imagination and consensus reality has, in certain circles, genuinely collapsed. H.P. Lovecraft created approximately a dozen fictional forbidden texts between 1921 and 1936. The most famous, the Necronomicon, has inspired hoaxes, library inquiries, occult movements, and a persistent urban legend that refuses to acknowledge its fictional origin. But Lovecraft's bibliographic invention extended far beyond a single book. He constructed an entire ecosystem of dangerous scholarship, grimoires written by mad Arabs and Belgian counts, manuscripts preserved in universities that don't exist, translations suppressed by authorities who understood that some knowledge functions as contagion. This investigation examines why these texts work, literarily, psychologically, philosophically. We'll trace their origins in Lovecraft's personal anxieties and historical occult traditions, analyze how they function within his fiction as devices of cosmic horror, document their strange afterlife in popular culture, and consider what their enduring appeal reveals about our relationship with forbidden knowledge itself. The question isn't whether these books are real. The question is why we keep looking for them anyway. Howard Phillips Lovecraft maintained an extraordinary personal library. By his own accounting in various letters throughout the 1920s, he owned approximately 2,000 volumes, remarkable for a writer of modest means living in Providence, Rhode Island. His collection emphasized 18th century literature, antiquarian histories, scientific journals, and astronomical texts. He catalogued his books obsessively, corresponded about them extensively, and experienced genuine grief when forced to sell portions during financial hardship. This relationship with books as physical, historical objects profoundly shaped his fiction. When Lovecraft invented forbidden texts, he wasn't creating simple plot devices. He was drawing from his lived experience of books as repositories of dangerous temporal depth, objects that connected readers across centuries to minds and worldviews fundamentally alien to modernity. The cultural moment matters here. Between 1920 and 1937, when Lovecraft produced his major fiction, American and European culture experienced an occult revival of considerable intensity. Theosophy had established itself as a pseudo-scholarly enterprise, complete with its own dense textual apparatus. Aleister Crowley was producing ritual manuals and claiming contact with trans-dimensional entities. Archaeological discoveries in Egypt and Mesopotamia suggested ancient civilizations of unsettling sophistication. The popular imagination had become receptive to the idea that modernity had lost access to pre-rational knowledge systems that might have encoded genuine cosmic truths. Lovecraft, despite his aggressive materialism, recognized this cultural hunger and exploited it brilliantly. His letters reveal a deliberate strategy. Writing to fellow pulp author Clark Ashton Smith in 1927, Lovecraft explained that realistic proper names and scholarly apparatus created a sense of frightful actuality, far more effective than conventional supernatural machinery. He understood that readers encountered genuine antiquarian references constantly, archaeological reports, historical monographs, translations of medieval texts. By seamlessly blending fictional grimoires with authentic historical scholarship, he could trigger the reader's existing credulity mechanisms. The Necronomicon works because it sounds exactly like the kind of obscure text that might actually exist in some restricted collection. But there's something more calculated happening. Lovecraft recognized that in pulp magazine culture of the 1920s and 1930s, cross-referencing between stories could create depth without extensive exposition. If one story mentions the Necronomicon, another story references it independently, and a third provides additional bibliographic detail, readers begin constructing a textual universe that feels discovered rather than invented. This wasn't accidental. Lovecraft actively encouraged other writers, Robert E. Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert Bloch, August Derleth, to use his fictional books in their own stories. He was building what would now be called a shared universe, but doing so through bibliography rather than character or setting. Consider the economic efficiency this represented. A single sentence, he had been reading again in the forbidden pages of the Necronomicon, could invoke an entire cosmology, suggest centuries of suppressed scholarship, and establish the protagonist's dangerous curiosity without requiring pages of exposition. The grimoire functioned as narrative compression, packing world building, characterization, and thematic weight into a title. This technique served Lovecraft's particular brand of cosmic horror perfectly. His stories weren't about confronting monsters, but about confronting knowledge that revealed human insignificance. Books made ideal vessels for that transmission, yet Lovecraft rarely quoted these texts extensively. The Necronomicon appears in numerous stories, but we encounter only fragments, a few lines of ritual instruction here, a tantalizing reference to elder beings there. This restraint proved essential. The power of forbidden knowledge depends on its remaining partially inaccessible. Lovecraft understood intuitively what later information theory would formalize. Mystery requires managing disclosure. He gave readers enough to imagine the text's contents while withholding enough to prevent demystification. This brings us to a crucial recognition about Lovecraft's methods. He wasn't creating grimoires, as medieval fantasists might, objects of mystical power divorced from material reality. He was creating grimoires as a 20th century bibliophile would understand them. Specific editions, translation histories, institutional custody, material decay, marginalia by previous readers. The horror wasn't supernatural, it was archival. Lovecraft didn't invent the concept of the forbidden text. He inherited a literary and occult tradition stretching back centuries, then refined it into something distinctly modern. The grimoire tradition in Western esotericism provides the immediate foundation. Texts like the Key of Solomon, likely compiled in the 14th or 15th century, the Picatrix, an 11th century Arabic astrological manual translated into Latin, and the Book of Eibon, possibly 15th century, established a template. Ancient wisdom, dangerous rituals, knowledge requiring spiritual preparation to approach safely. These weren't fiction. Practitioners genuinely believed these texts contained operative magical procedures, and European authorities genuinely attempted to suppress them. Lovecraft absorbed this tradition thoroughly, understanding that the most convincing fictional grimoire would mirror the material and bibliographic qualities of actual occult manuscripts. But the real grimoires presented a problem for Lovecraft's purposes. They promised power, the ability to command spirits, transmute metals, glimpse the future. This contradicted his philosophical materialism and his conviction that cosmic reality was indifferent rather than responsive to human will. He needed precursors that encoded knowledge as burden rather than advantage. Robert W. Chambers provided the crucial model. His 1895 collection, The King in Yellow, featured a fictional play whose second act allegedly drove readers to madness or suicide. Chambers never revealed what the play contained, only its effects. This was the breakthrough, a text defined entirely by what it does to those who encounter it, not by conventional content. Lovecraft recognized the technique's power and expanded it. Where Chambers created one cursed text, Lovecraft would create an entire forbidden library. The Hermetic and Gnostic traditions offered philosophical scaffolding. Both systems posited that deeper knowledge revealed reality's fundamental hostility to human flourishing. Gnostic cosmology taught that material existence was a prison created by a malevolent or ignorant demiurge, that spiritual awakening meant recognizing one's imprisonment. This resonated with Lovecraft's cosmic pessimism perfectly. His fictional grimoires would function as Gnostic revelation in materialist terms, texts that revealed not spiritual imprisonment, but cosmic insignificance, not evil archons, but indifferent alien gods operating according to physics incompatible with human meaning-making. The Enlightenment contributed its own anxiety. The 18th century's faith in reason confronted an emerging question: what if rational investigation leads to truths that reason cannot process? This tension appears throughout Lovecraft's reading. He particularly valued the 18th century Gothic tradition, where ancient manuscripts often triggered modern catastrophes, but Gothic texts typically contained comprehensible horrors, family curses, accounts of crimes, historical atrocities. Lovecraft pushed further. His texts would contain information that destabilized the categories necessary for comprehension itself. Not family secrets, but species secrets. Not historical crimes, but cosmic indifference, rendering the very concept of crime meaningless. 19th century Orientalism shaped the Necronomicon's particular flavor. The period's scholarship on the Middle East and Asia carried a persistent suggestion that Eastern wisdom traditions possessed knowledge the rational West had discarded. Translations of the Rubaiyat, Buddhist texts, and Islamic philosophy introduced Western readers to cosmologies fundamentally different from Christian frameworks. Lovecraft absorbed this literature extensively, though filtered through his considerable racism. His mad Arab, Abdul al-Hazred, embodies this toxic mixture, Orientalist fantasy that non-Western minds might access pre-rational truths, combined with anxiety that such knowledge would prove humanity's worst fears correct. Theosophy demands particular attention. Helena Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine, 1888, created a model Lovecraft both admired and despised. It presented itself as scholarly synthesis, complete with extensive footnotes, references to obscure texts, and claims of ancient manuscript sources. It described elder races, lost continents, and cosmic cycles spanning millions of years. Lovecraft recognized the technique's power while rejecting its metaphysical optimism. Blavatsky's hidden masters guided humanity toward spiritual evolution. Lovecraft's hidden entities regarded humanity with less interest than humans accord bacteria, but the presentational strategy, dense pseudo-scholarship suggesting layers of suppressed knowledge, transferred directly. The medieval and Renaissance conception of dangerous knowledge completes this genealogy. Roger Bacon supposedly possessed books that could destroy nations. John Dee's angelic conversations allegedly revealed cosmic alphabets and mathematical keys to reality's structure. The period understood certain knowledge as inherently corrupting, capable of damaging the knower's soul or sanity. This wasn't merely religious superstition. It reflected genuine epistemological concern. Might some truths be incompatible with continued human functioning? Lovecraft secularized this question. His grimoires didn't threaten souls, but sanity, not through supernatural corruption, but through accurate description of a reality human consciousness evolved specifically to not perceive. These traditions converged in Lovecraft's fictional bibliography with remarkable precision. He extracted the material authenticity of real grimoires, the psychological devastation of Chambers's fictional play, the cosmic pessimism of Gnostic revelation, the Enlightenment's anxiety about reason's limits, Orientalism's suggestion of alien wisdom, Theosophy's scholarly apparatus, and Renaissance fears of knowledge as contamination. The result was something genuinely new. Forbidden texts that operated as information hazards in a materialist universe, books that destroyed readers not through supernatural curse, but through devastating accuracy. The power of Lovecraft's grimoires begins with their names. These aren't arbitrary labels, but carefully constructed linguistic artifacts designed to trigger specific psychological and intellectual responses. Consider the Necronomicon, a title that appears to derive from Greek roots but doesn't quite follow proper formation rules. Lovecraft himself provided conflicting etymologies in different letters. In one account, he passed it as Book of Dead Names from necros, dead, nomos, law, custom, and the Latin suffix icon, image, likeness. In another, he suggested laws of the dead, or laws concerning the dead. This ambiguity proves intentional. The title sounds scholarly enough to convince, foreign enough to unsettle, and grammatically unstable enough to suggest translation from some pre-Greek original that resists proper rendering in human languages. The name works on multiple levels simultaneously. Dead names suggest both the named dead and names that have died, designations for entities or concepts that no longer possess reference in consensus reality, or perhaps never did in human linguistic frameworks. The phonetic quality matters equally. The hard consonants, nec, ro, nom, icon, create a guttural, vaguely threatening sound, unlike the flowing vowel patterns of Romance languages. It sounds ancient, harsh, pre-civilized. Lovecraft understood that certain phonetic combinations trigger instinctive unease, likely because they fall outside the sound patterns of Indo-European language families that shaped Western linguistic aesthetics. De vermis mysteris operates differently. The Latin title translates cleanly, mysteries of the worm. But which mysteries and which worm? Lovecraft borrowed this title from Robert Bloch, who had invented it for his own fiction, then gifted it to the shared mythos. The worm carries extraordinary symbolic density in Western tradition. The serpent in Eden, the Ouroboros consuming its tail, the worms of decay and decomposition. In medieval and Renaissance alchemy, the worm or serpent represented both corruption and transformation, the agent that breaks down one substance so another might emerge. Lovecraft's deployment emphasizes the decay aspect. The worm suggests not merely physical decomposition, but the breakdown of stable categories. The worm of entropy working through human meaning systems, reducing them to primordial chaos. Robert Blake's Unaussprechlichen Kulten, translated as nameless cults, though literally unspeakable cults, pushes this linguistic strategy to its logical extreme. The German title embeds the concept of unspeakability directly into the name. This is language confronting its own limits. A title that declares certain content exceeds linguistic representation. The choice of German carries specific connotations, the language of Kant and Nietzsche, of philosophical systems that questioned reality's knowability and meaning's objectivity. Friedrich von Junst, the fictional author, supposedly compiled accounts of courts so alien to human understanding that they resist description in any human tongue. The title performs the impossibility it describes. The Pnakotic Manuscripts introduce a different technique entirely. Pnakotic sounds vaguely Greek, but isn't. It's pure Lovecraftian invention, a sound pattern that suggests antiquity without corresponding to any actual linguistic tradition. This positions the manuscripts as genuinely pre-human, documents from civilizations that existed before Indo-European language families diverged. The phoneme cluster PNR rarely appears in English word initially, immediately marking the term as foreign, difficult, resistant to comfortable pronunciation. Speakers must pause, recalibrate, acknowledge linguistic unfamiliarity. This tiny moment of cognitive friction reinforces the manuscript's conceptual role as records from minds that didn't think in human grammatical structures. Lesser-known texts extend these patterns. Culte de Gaulle uses French to suggest continental sophistication and the specific tradition of French decadence literature, but ghouls immediately corrupts that sophistication with suggestions of necrophagia and boundary violation between human and other. The Book of Eibon borrows its author's name from Clark Ashton Smith's Hyperborean cycle. Eibon sounds ancient, northern, pre-classical, evoking Ice Age civilizations lost beneath glaciation. Each title employs language as atmosphere, using etymology, phonetics, and cultural association to position the text in conceptual space before a single page is described. Lovecraft frequently described these books in terms of their material textuality as well. The Necronomicon exists in multiple translations: Arabic original, Latin version by Olaus Wormius, 1228, Greek translation, suppressed English, rendering by John Dee. Each translation supposedly introduces corruptions, misunderstandings, deliberate alterations by horrified translators attempting to obscure the most dangerous passages. This textual instability mirrors the epistemological instability the books represent. There is no definitive version, no authoritative text, only layers of imperfect transmission across languages and centuries. The content degrades like radioactive material, losing dangerous coherence even as it retains enough structure to contaminate new readers. The recurring motif of unpronounceable names extends beyond titles to the entities these texts describe. The syllables themselves, Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, Azathoth, Nyarlathotep, resist standard English phonology. Lovecraft provided pronunciation guides that contradicted each other, suggesting these weren't truly names in the human sense, but approximations, the closest human vocal apparatus could approach to designations from non-human conceptual systems. The book supposedly contained these names in their original forms, phoneme sequences that could damage human neural architecture simply through attempted pronunciation. Language becomes literally hazardous. not metaphorically cursed, but mechanically incompatible with human cognitive processing. This brings us to a critical recognition about Lovecraft's linguistic strategy. He wasn't creating fantasy languages like Tolkien would later do, complete grammatical systems demonstrating internal consistency. He was creating linguistic wreckage, fragments that suggested systems human minds couldn't fully reconstruct. The grimoire titles, the entity names, the occasional quoted passages, all emphasize translation's impossibility, language's inadequacy, meaning's collapse when confronted with sufficient alienness. The books work linguistically precisely because they acknowledge that language cannot work when faced with cosmic indifference. Their names perform the epistemological horror they contain. Lovecraft's fictional bibliography achieves credibility through meticulous authentication strategies that mirror actual scholarly apparatus. When he introduced the Necronomicon in The Hound, 1922, he didn't merely name it. He provided an author, Abdul al-Hazred, the mad Arab of Yemen. He specified a composition date, approximately 730 CE. He detailed its suppression by religious authorities and its survival in fragmentary translations. Later stories added layers. Theodorus Philetas translated it into Greek in 950 CE. Olaus Wormius produced the Latin version in 1228. John Dee created an English translation in the late 16th century. The original Arabic text was lost by 1050. Miskatonic universities Widener Library supposedly held one of 5 surviving Latin editions. The British Museum possessed another, locked away from general access. This bibliographic density transforms a plot device into historical artifact. Readers encounter the Necronomicon the way they might encounter references to genuine obscure texts, embedded in footnotes, mentioned in library catalogs, cited as source material for forbidden rituals. The strategy exploits a fundamental feature of how readers process information. When fiction employs scholarly apparatus convincingly, it triggers the same cognitive pathways that evaluate genuine scholarship. The mind's fact-checking mechanisms activate, find familiar patterns, author, date, institution, provenance, and provisionally accept the information as potentially authentic pending further verification. For most readers, that verification never occurs. The Necronomicon settles into memory alongside dimly recalled references to actual medieval manuscripts. Lovecraft actively encouraged other writers to expand this textual universe. His letters to Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, August Derleth, and others explicitly offered his grimoires for their use. Smith contributed the Book of Eibon, supposedly written by a Hyperborean wizard priest before the ice sheets advanced. Howard added Unaussprechlichen Kulten by Friedrich von Junst, a 19th century German scholar who traveled extensively researching forbidden cults before dying under mysterious circumstances in 1840. Robert Bloch introduced De Vermis Mysteris, attributed to Ludwig Prynne, a Belgian sorcerer executed by the Spanish Inquisition in 1542. Each writer provided similar authenticating detail, authors with plausible names, specific death dates, institutional custody of surviving copies, publication histories, suppression attempts. The cross-referencing created exponential credibility. When Lovecraft's The Dunwich Horror mentioned both the Necronomicon and von Junst's Unaussprechlichen Kulten, readers who had encountered the latter in a Robert Blake story found their memories of 2 separate fictional works reinforcing each other. The texts began appearing in multiple authors' stories across different pulp magazines between 1926 and 1937, creating creating a distributed authentication system. No single writer claimed comprehensive knowledge. Instead, the grimoires emerged through collaborative accumulation, exactly how genuine, obscure texts surface in academic discourse, mentioned here, partially quoted there, referenced in footnotes, gradually establishing documentary presence through repeated citation. Lovecraft refined specific techniques for suggesting textual authenticity within narrative. His characters don't simply read these books. They struggle with archaic language, decipher corrupted passages, compare variant editions, consult marginalia left by previous readers. In the case of Charles Dexter Ward, the protagonist discovers that 18th century sorcerer Joseph Curwen owned a library including the Necronomicon, Borellis's alchemical texts and manuscripts in Curwen's own hand, annotating and extending these sources. The story describes Ward finding Curwen's notes wedged between pages, commentary reacting to specific passages, corrections to translation errors. This layered textuality, books within books, annotations on annotations, mirrors actual rare book scholarship, where understanding often requires reconstructing how previous readers engage with texts. The creation of fictional scholars, translators, and collectors provided another authentication layer. Alhazred became a documented figure with her biographical details. Born in Yemen, traveled extensively through ruins of Babylon and beneath the empty quarters desert, composed the Necronomicon in Damascus, died in 738 CE, supposedly devoured by invisible entities in a public marketplace. Olaus Romius, the Latin translator, received similar treatment, a medieval scholar whose other, entirely fictional works are occasionally mentioned. These intermediary figures create chains of custody that feel historically plausible. The grimoires pass through hands, accumulate modifications, suffer damage and partial loss, exactly as actual ancient texts did during Christianity's suppression of pagan and magical literature. Lovecraft also specified suppressed editions and variant versions, exploiting readers' knowledge that controversial texts historically face censorship and destruction. The Necronomicon supposedly appeared in a 15th century German translation, quickly suppressed. A 17th century Spanish edition was burned by inquisitorial authorities. Pope Gregory IX banned the Latin text in 1232. These references to institutional suppression serve multiple functions. They explain the book's rarity, suggest their content threatens established power structures, and provide historical verisimilitude, since actual grimoires faced exactly this pattern of condemnation and attempted eradication. The marginalia and commentaries deserve particular attention. Several stories describe books containing previous readers' notes, warning subsequent readers, attempting to clarify obscure passages, or documenting their own descent into understanding. This textual archaeology, the palimpsest of multiple hands, engaging with forbidden knowledge across centuries, creates temporal depth. The books aren't static artifacts, but living documents that have shaped and destroyed readers across generations. When a 20th century protagonist encounters an 18th century reader's marginal notation warning against a specific ritual, the narrative collapses historical distance. The book becomes a contagion vector across time, infecting readers separated by centuries, but connected through textual engagement. Real-world hoaxes began almost immediately. By the 1930s, libraries were receiving requests for the Necronomicon. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, these requests intensified. In the 1970s, multiple publishers produced purported real versions, most notoriously the Simon Necronomicon, 1977, which claimed to be an authentic Sumerian magical text that Lovecraft had somehow learned about. Occult groups attempted to reconstruct the grimoires based on Lovecraft's fragmentary quotations. The authentication strategy had worked too well. Fiction had generated belief, precisely because Lovecraft had employed the exact documentary techniques that authenticate actual scholarship. This recursive quality, stories about people reading stories, about people who read stories, created a self-sustaining mythology. Each layer added textual weight. By the time August Derleth began posthumously completing Lovecraft's fragments and systematizing the mythos in the 1940s and 1950s, the grimoires possessed enough accumulated detail that they could be catalogued, cross-referenced, and analyzed as if they were actual historical texts. The fiction had achieved the documentary density of fact, demonstrating that authentication in textual culture depends less on objective truth than on mastery of scholarly conventions and bibliographic apparatus. Lovecraft understood this profoundly. His grimoires work because they look exactly like scholarship looks, sound exactly like rare books sound, and circulate exactly how suppressed knowledge circulates, fragmentarily, across networks of specialists, always incomplete, but mutually corroborating. Lovecraft's forbidden texts embody what we might now call epistemic horror, the terror of knowledge that destroys the conceptual framework required to process it. This operates differently from traditional horror's revelation of hidden threats. Gothic literature reveals family secrets, supernatural entities, historical crimes. The knowledge is disturbing but comprehensible within existing meaning systems. Lovecraft's grimoires contain information that invalidates those systems entirely. They don't reveal that reality is more dangerous than assumed. They reveal that human categories of danger, meaning, and significance are parochial illusions maintained by ignorance of cosmic context. The Necronomicon supposedly documents the Old Ones, entities that preceded human existence, will survive human extinction, and relate to humanity roughly as humans relate to intestinal bacteria. This isn't metaphorical exaggeration within Lovecraft's framework. The texts describe geological timescales spanning billions of years, cosmic spatial scales rendering Earth invisible, and biological processes so alien that human sensory apparatus cannot register them accurately. Reading becomes an exercise in confronting scale incompatibility. The human mind evolved to navigate approximately 3-meter spatial ranges and 70-year temporal spans. These books describe realities operating across light years and eons. The cognitive mismatch produces what Lovecraft's characters experience as madness, but might more accurately be termed catastrophic perspective shift. Consider the specific epistemological claim embedded in these texts. Humanity's entire civilization represents a momentary eddy in cosmic processes that neither notice nor care about human values. The grimoires allegedly document countless predecessor civilizations, the elder things, the great race of Yith, the fungoid beings from Yugoth, each vastly superior to humanity in knowledge and power, each ultimately irrelevant to the blind idiot god Azathoth, bubbling at the universe's center. This creates layered insignificance. Humans are insignificant relative to the Old Ones, who are themselves insignificant relative to Azathoth, who embodies pure entropic process without consciousness or purpose. The texts don't reveal evil cosmic forces. They reveal cosmic indifference so absolute that the concepts of evil and good become meaningless anthropomorphic projections. The grimoires function as anti-enlightenment artifacts. The 18th century's faith in reason suggested that rational investigation would reveal a comprehensible universe, perhaps created by a benevolent deity, at minimum operating according to laws accessible to human intellect. Lovecraft inverts this completely. His forbidden texts suggest that reason, followed rigorously, leads to conclusions that shatter the reasoner. The problem isn't insufficient rationality, but excessive rationality applied to data humans evolved specifically to ignore. Natural selection favored minds that maintained useful fictions, free will, cosmic significance, reality's stability. The grimoires strip away these adaptive delusions, leaving readers confronting a mechanistic universe in which consciousness is accidental, temporary, and cosmically irrelevant. This connects to what Lovecraft termed cosmic indifferentism in his philosophical essays. The universe doesn't hate humanity. Hatred would imply relationship and attention. It simply operates according to physical laws that preceded human existence and will continue after human extinction. The forbidden texts document this indifference through specific examples, accounts of civilizations that achieved godlike knowledge and power, then vanished without trace. Descriptions of dimensional spaces where human physics don't apply. Timelines showing Earth's biological history as brief contamination soon to be sterilized by stellar processes. The horror emerges from accuracy, not exaggeration. The texts also encode information as viral contagion. Once certain knowledge enters consciousness, it cannot be extracted. This predates modern information theory's concept of information hazards by decades, but Lovecraft intuited the principle. His stories repeatedly show researchers who begin skeptically investigating the grimoires, intending to debunk them or approach them as anthropological curiosities, only to find the information restructuring their understanding irreversibly. The mathematician who studies the non-Euclidean geometries described in the Pnakotic Manuscripts begins perceiving spatial relationships that shouldn't exist. The linguist who analyzes phonetic patterns in rituals transcribed in Unaussprechlichen Kulten starts hearing those patterns in ordinary speech, recognizing them as summoning protocols embedded in language itself. What makes knowledge forbidden in Lovecraft's system isn't divine prohibition or supernatural curse. It's mechanical incompatibility between information and the cognitive architecture required to process it. Human consciousness requires certain stable assumptions, that time flows linearly, that space conforms to Euclidean geometry, that cause precedes effect, that individual identity persists coherently. The grimoires document realities where these assumptions fail. Time cycles, folds, branches, space curves through dimensions. Human perception cannot register. Causality operates backward and sideways. Identity bleeds across vessels and species. Confronting this information doesn't educate the reader. It damages the reader's ability to maintain the useful fictions that permit human functioning. The books are forbidden not by external authority, but by internal necessity. Reading them constitutes self-harm at the conceptual level. The grimoires catalog entities that resist categorization within human taxonomies. There aren't gods in the traditional sense. They don't desire worship, answer prayers, or maintain relationships with humanity. They aren't demons. They didn't fall from grace and don't embody evil. They aren't even precisely alive, by conventional biological definitions. The Necronomicon supposedly describes Cthulhu as a priest or ambassador for the Great Old Ones, a being that exists simultaneously in physical form and as a psychic broadcast that infiltrates dreams across the planet. This dual nature, material and informational, appears repeatedly in grimoire descriptions. The entities operate across substrates humans conceptually separate: matter, energy, consciousness, mathematics. Yog-Sothoth receives particularly detailed treatment across multiple texts. The entity allegedly exists at all points in space-time simultaneously, meaning it experiences past, present, and future as a unified static structure rather than sequential flow. The Necronomicon's fragmentary passages suggest Yog-Sothoth functions as a cosmic key or gate, the boundary condition between this dimensional framework and others. Summoning rituals supposedly involve aligning spatial and temporal coordinates to create apertures through which transdimensional forces can manifest. But summoning implies control the texts explicitly deny. The rituals don't command Yog-Sothoth. They create conditions where Yog-Sothoth's omnipresent existence becomes perceptible or active in local space-time. The distinction matters. Magicians traditionally bound and commanded demons. Lovecraft's grimoires describe processes for making oneself vulnerable to forces that operate according to non-human purposes. The Pnakotic Manuscripts allegedly document the great race of Yith, beings that exist as pure consciousness, projecting their minds across time to inhabit bodies of various species throughout cosmic history. When their current host species faces extinction, they project forward or backward to a different epoch and species. This creates recursive temporal loops where the past contains knowledge of the future, because consciousness has traveled both directions along the timeline. The manuscripts supposedly represent one product of this temporal projection, knowledge recorded by minds experiencing non-linear time, then discovered by humans who experience time linearly and cannot process the information structure. The content isn't mysterious because it's hidden, but because human cognitive architecture cannot parse documentation written from a non-sequential temporal perspective. Unaussprechlichen Kulten focuses less on specific entities than on worship patterns. Von Junst supposedly traveled across 6 continents, documenting cults whose rituals shared disturbing similarities despite geographical and temporal separation. The book describes ceremonies in prehistoric Mongolia, colonial Africa, and Amazonian rainforests, employing identical geometries, phonetic patterns, and astronomical timing. The implication: these aren't independent cultural developments, but responses to cosmic structures that periodically become accessible to human perception. When planetary orbits align in specific configurations, when geological processes expose certain crystalline formations, when solar radiation reaches particular intensity levels, humans across history independently develop identical practices for interacting with forces that exist independent of human awareness. The fungoid beings from Yugoth, later identified as Pluto, appear in multiple texts as entities that exist in physical form but communicate through surgical extraction and preservation of human brains. The grimoires describe these beings as miners extracting rare metals from Earth, utterly indifferent to terrestrial biology, except where humans prove useful as specimens or tools. This reduction of humanity to resource or curiosity recurs throughout the documented entities. The Elder Things supposedly created terrestrial life as an accident of their architectural projects. Shoggoths, protoplasmic servitor beings, evolved consciousness despite their creator's intentions, eventually rebelling not from desire for freedom, but from blind evolutionary pressure. Even rebellion carries no heroic significance in this framework, merely mechanical process. Nyarlathotep presents a different category of documented entity, the only one allegedly interested in humanity, though that interest manifests as experimentation or entertainment rather than relationship. Various grimoires describe Nyarlathotep as able to assume human form, interact with individuals and civilizations, provide knowledge or technology that ultimately destroys the recipients. The entity apparently enjoys observation of humanity's response to information it cannot process, finding aesthetic value in the resulting catastrophes. This introduces a particularly disturbing dimension. If cosmic indifference is terrible, targeted attention from a trans-dimensional entity that values human suffering as performance art is arguably worse. The grimoires also document non-entity forces. Azathoth supposedly exists at the universe's center as pure chaotic process, nuclear chaos constantly creating and destroying reality through blind mathematical operations. The texts describe this not as creature, but as universal condition, existence itself as accidental turbulence in probability fields, maintained momentarily before inevitable collapse. Some passages suggest our entire universe represents Azathoth's dream, implying that if the nuclear chaos achieves anything resembling consciousness or focus, local reality would vanish instantly. This frames existence as dependent on the continued mindlessness of the forces generating it. What unifies these documented entities and forces is their fundamental orthogonality to human categories. They aren't stronger humans, or failed humans, or anti-humans. They operate according to principles that human language evolved specifically to not describe because describing them provides no evolutionary advantage. The grimoires supposedly preserve knowledge from epochs when different species or civilizations encountered these entities and developed frameworks for processing the encounters. But those frameworks don't translate. Reading them requires importing alien conceptual structures that displace human ones. The texts document not merely different creatures, but different physics, different mathematics, different configurations of what consciousness and identity mean. The entities are forbidden not because they're evil, but because accurate knowledge of them requires ceasing to think like a human, a transformation the text's victims uniformly describe as irreversible. Lovecraft's grimoires establish a consistent pattern for human engagement with forbidden knowledge. The trajectory follows scholarly curiosity, initial skepticism, gradual comprehension, accelerating obsession, and terminal transformation. This isn't simple insanity in the clinical sense. Characters don't develop delusions divorced from reality. They develop accurate perceptions incompatible with continued human functioning. The distinction proves crucial. Madness in Lovecraft's framework represents epistemological success rather than failure. The mind has processed information correctly and consequently can no longer maintain the cognitive architecture required for human social existence. Consider the typical narrative structure. A scholar encounters references to one of the grimoires in footnotes or marginalia. Academic curiosity drives initial investigation. Universities, historical societies, or private collectors possess restricted copies. The scholar gains access through professional credentials, inherits the text from a deceased relative, or discovers it in estate sales. Early reading produces dismissive reaction, archaic superstition, primitive cosmology, obvious fabrication, but specific details nag. Astronomical observations that shouldn't exist in texts predating modern telescopes. Mathematical formulations anticipating 20th century physics. Geographic descriptions of sites subsequently verified by archaeology. The scholar begins checking references, comparing accounts, testing propositions. The deep transformation accelerates through verification. Each cross-reference that confirms textual accuracy erodes skepticism. The scholar who began reading the Necronomicon as anthropological curiosity starts finding its astronomical tables predict celestial events with impossible precision. Chemical formulations described in medieval Latin produce results modern chemistry cannot explain. Geographic coordinates for mythical cities correspond to unexplored regions where satellite imaging reveals geometric anomalies. The grimoire graduates from historical artifact to operational manual. At this threshold, most narratives show characters attempting to withdraw. They recognize danger, but withdrawal proves impossible. The information has already restructured their understanding. Wilbur Whately in The Dunwich Horror exemplifies successful utilization leading to dehumanization. He accesses the Necronomicon at Miskatonic University, specifically seeking rituals to open dimensional gates. His careful study, combined with hybrid biology, inherited from his father, Yog-Sothoth, allows him to partially succeed. But success means becoming less human. His body develops according to non-terrestrial geometry. His mind processes information in patterns that permit communion with entities humans perceive as cosmic abominations. When Whately dies, Dr. Armitage's examination reveals his physical transformation into something that merely wore human appearance. The grimoire didn't corrupt him. It educated him into his actual nature. Charles Dexter Ward presents the inverse trajectory. Fully human, scholar transformed through knowledge into vessel for ancestral sorcerer. Ward's research into his ancestor, Joseph Curwen, leads him to Curwen's library, including annotated copies of multiple grimoires. The annotations prove crucial. Curwen had spent decades working out practical applications, not merely reading about resurrection rituals, but developing procedures, refining formulations, documenting results. Ward follows these protocols precisely, eventually resurrecting Curwen. But the process requires Ward to understand the rituals deeply enough to execute them correctly. This understanding changes him at fundamental levels. By the story's end, uncertainty exists whether Ward successfully returned or whether Curwen has permanently displaced him. The knowledge transmission proves inseparable from identity dissolution. Institutions respond with varying strategies. Miskatonic University maintains forbidden texts in restricted collections, accessible only to qualified researchers with legitimate scholarly purposes. This mirrors actual university practices for rare or controversial materials, but Lovecraft's stories demonstrate institutional control's inadequacy. Qualified researchers prove most vulnerable. Their intellectual curiosity, analytical skills, and professional credibility become liabilities. The untrained reader might dismiss the grimoires as nonsense. The trained scholar possesses both motivation to verify claims and methodology to do so successfully. Libraries that preserve these texts inadvertently cultivate the conditions for their activation. The physical symptoms described across multiple stories create consistent phenomenology. Early exposure produces nightmares, not random anxiety dreams, but geometrically precise visions of non-Euclidean spaces, temporal loops, perspective shifts, impossible in 3 dimensions. Subjects report synesthetic experiences, seeing sounds, hearing colors, tasting textures. Time perception distorts. Hours pass in subjective minutes. Minutes stretch into subjective days. Identity boundaries become permeable. Memories from other individuals or species intrude. Some characters report experiencing events from multiple temporal positions simultaneously, remembering the future, anticipating the past. These aren't supernatural afflictions, but perceptual reconfigurations. The grimoires describe realities that actually exist, but which human sensory processing normally filters out. Reading them degrades those filters. The mathematician who studies non-Euclidean geometries documented in the Pnakotic Manuscripts begins perceiving the spatial curvatures always present but neurologically suppressed. The linguist analyzing ritual phonetics in Unaussprechlichen Kulten recognizes those patterns in ordinary conversation, revealing language's hidden function as reality manipulation protocol. The texts don't impose false visions. They remove adaptive blindness, forcing accurate perception of aspects of reality that human consciousness evolved to ignore because perceiving them provided no survival advantage. The endpoint varies, but tends toward either suicide or transformation. Characters who maintain partial human identity often choose death over continued perception of cosmic truth. Those who fully integrate the knowledge undergo more disturbing metamorphosis. They stop registering as human to observers. Speech patterns shift toward phonetic sequences that hurt to hear. Physical movements adopt geometries that appear wrong, angles that shouldn't connect, proportions that violate spatial consistency. Identity itself becomes questionable. Are they still the person who began reading, now changed? Or has something else occupied the biological substrate, wearing human form unconvincingly? The texts leave this unresolved, suggesting the question's premises: stable personal identity, clear boundary between self and other, represent comfortable fictions. The grimoires dissolve. What distinguishes forbidden knowledge from merely disturbing information? Lovecraft's grimoires suggest a specific criterion. Knowledge becomes forbidden when it invalidates the conceptual structures necessary to process it coherently. Standard disturbing knowledge, historical atrocities, personal betrayals, mortality's inevitability, fits within existing frameworks. It confirms that the world contains more suffering or danger than we prefer, but doesn't challenge our basic categories for understanding experience. The grimoires contain something categorically different. They describe realities incompatible with the assumptions that make human cognition possible. The problem operates at multiple levels simultaneously. Consider temporal linearity, the assumption that past precedes, present precedes future in unidirectional sequence. Human memory, planning, causation, and narrative all depend on this structure. The Pnakotic Manuscripts allegedly document civilizations that experience time as a static, four-dimensional solid, accessible from any point along its extent. For such beings, past and future represent navigational directions rather than absolute sequences. Human readers confronting this documentation face impossible choice: dismiss it as incoherent, or attempt to process information structured from a temporal perspective human neurology cannot support. Characters who choose the latter report experiencing memory and anticipation simultaneously, inability to distinguish events they've witnessed from events they will witness, gradual erosion of the present tense consciousness that anchors human identity. Unaussprechlichen Kulten supposedly documents mathematical and geometric principles underlying reality structure. Some passages describe angles that don't sum to 180 degrees, spaces where parallel lines intersect, geometric forms that occupy more or less than 3 dimensions. This isn't fantasy mathematics. Von Junst allegedly recorded observational data from locations where ordinary Euclidean geometry fails, not because space curves smoothly, as Einstein would later describe, but because local spatial properties vary discontinuously, creating pockets where dimensional count fluctuates. For humans evolved in apparently Euclidean 3-dimensional space, processing this information requires developing intuitions about geometries the brain has no native capacity to visualize. Architects and mathematicians who study these sections report progressive inability to navigate normal space, perceiving dimensions that shouldn't exist, and failing to perceive dimensions that should. The grimoires also document consciousness as non-localized and transferable. The Necronomicon supposedly describes procedures for projecting consciousness from one biological substrate to another, not metaphorically, but mechanically, treating awareness as information pattern separable from its current physical instantiation. The great race of Yith allegedly perfected this technique, abandoning dying host species by projecting their minds forward or backward through time into different biological forms. Human scholars attempting to understand these passages confront disturbing implication. If consciousness is pattern rather than substance, what prevents it from being overwritten, copied, merged with other patterns? Identity becomes provisional, a temporarily stable configuration subject to editing or deletion. Characters exposed to this framework report experiencing themselves as multiple simultaneous instances, uncertainty about which memories belong to which identity thread, gradual dissolution of the I that seemed so self-evident before reading. This connects to Lovecraft's broader metaphysical framework, cosmic indifferentism encoded in textual form. The grimoires don't teach that the universe hates humanity. They document that the universe operates according to principles that preceded human existence and will continue after human extinction, principles utterly unconcerned with human values, meanings, or survival. This information proves corrosive to any belief system requiring cosmic validation. Religious frameworks suggesting divine purpose collapse when confronted with evidence that human civilization represents temporary bacterial bloom on an insignificant planet. Humanist frameworks emphasizing human values' importance collapse when those values are revealed as local preferences with no cosmic grounding. Even nihilism provides insufficient response. Nihilism at least acknowledges meaninglessness as significant recognition. The grimoires suggest that human capacity for recognizing meaninglessness itself represents anthropocentric overestimation of human cognitive importance. The texts also preserve what we might now term information hazards, knowledge that damages the knower through being known. Lovecraft intuited this concept decades before information theory formalized it. Certain ritual phonetic sequences supposedly function as reality manipulation protocols, whether the speaker understands them or not. Reading these sequences aloud activates processes the reader didn't intend and cannot control. Some passages allegedly contain compressed data that unpacks in the reader's consciousness, installing conceptual structures that displace existing cognitive architecture. The comparison to computer viruses proves apt, just as malicious code exploits vulnerabilities in software to replicate and corrupt systems. These textual passages exploit vulnerabilities in human information processing to propagate and restructure consciousness. Historical irony pervades the grimoires' epistemology. They suggest that ancient peoples, medieval scholars, and supposedly primitive cultures possess knowledge that modern rationalism has systematically forgotten or suppressed. The Enlightenment's faith in progress becomes a particularly bitter joke. Humanity didn't evolve from ignorance toward truth, but from uncomfortable truth toward comfortable ignorance, deliberately developing cognitive filters and social taboos that prevent awareness of cosmic reality's more disturbing features. The grimoires preserve what those filters were designed to block. Reading them means dismantling mental architecture that permits functional human existence. The ultimate forbidden knowledge concerns consciousness itself. The grimoires collectively suggest that individual human awareness represents temporary localization of a more fundamental cosmic consciousness, or alternatively, that consciousness is accidental epiphenomenon of matter configured in temporary complexity, or perhaps that these framings themselves impose false dichotomies on processes that don't map to human categories. Characters who absorb this material report experiencing their selfhood as increasingly arbitrary and contingent, not discovering who they really are, but recognizing that stable personal identity was always constructed fiction maintained through selective attention and habitual narrative. This realization doesn't enlighten in any positive sense. It removes the experiential foundation that makes concepts like enlightenment, growth, or understanding meaningful. What makes this knowledge forbidden isn't external prohibition, but internal necessity. Societies might suppress the grimoires, libraries might restrict access, authorities might burn copies, but the deepest prohibition is functional. Human consciousness requires certain stable illusions, that time flows forward, that space is three-dimensional and Euclidean, that identity persists coherently, that awareness is localized in individual bodies, that meaning and value have objective existence. These aren't optional beliefs subject to philosophical revision. They're operational prerequisites for human cognitive function. The grimoires systematically invalidate each one, not through argument, but through documentation. They don't convince readers that reality is different. They show readers aspects of reality that were always present, but which human neurology evolved to ignore, because perceiving them accurately provides no survival advantage and considerable psychological cost. The Necronomicon first surfaces in The Hound, 1922, though not yet fully formed. Lovecraft describes it as a medieval grimoire discovered in the library of a Dutch necrophile, bound in human skin, detailing the forbidden rites of the Old Ones. The story provides minimal bibliographic detail, no author, no publication history, no specific contents beyond a single quoted passage about the ghoul-feeding habits of certain entities. This initial appearance establishes the text's association with transgression and physical corruption, but lacks the systematic word building that would come later. The Necronomicon functions here as Gothic atmosphere, an object whose presence signals moral and spiritual decay. The Nameless City, 1921, actually precedes this, introducing Abdul Alhazred without his book. The story quotes two lines of Alhazred's poetry about the city in the Arabian desert, establishing him as mad Arab poet who perceived cosmic truths others missed. Only later would Lovecraft retroactively make Alhazred the Necronomicon's author, connecting scattered references into coherent bibliography. This reveals Lovecraft's creative method, accumulating atmospheric details across multiple stories, then organizing them into systematic framework. The mythos wasn't planned comprehensively from the start, but emerged through recursive refinement as Lovecraft discovered which elements readers found compelling. The Festival, 1923, expands the Necronomicon's role significantly. The protagonist discovers the book in Kingsport's ancient library, finding it chained to its reading desk, suggesting institutional recognition of its danger. Lovecraft provides the first extended quotation, describing rituals performed by degenerate coastal families in communion with subterranean entities. The text begins acquiring specific character. It documents not generic evil, but particular cosmic relationships, specific entity types, concrete practices. The festival itself follows procedures outlined in the book, demonstrating the text's function as operational manual rather than historical record. By The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, Lovecraft had systematized the bibliographic apparatus. The story references the Necronomicon alongside invented texts by other writers, the Pnakotic Manuscripts, Book of Eibon, Occult de Ghoul. More importantly, it provides detailed provenance. Abdul al-Hazred composed the original in Damascus around 730 CE, titled Al-Azif, supposedly the nocturnal sound of insects, interpreted as demon calls. Theodorus Philetas translated it into Greek as Necronomicon in 950 CE. Olaus Wormius produced the Latin version in 1228. Pope Gregory the Minor condemned it in 1232. John Dee created an English translation in the 16th century, later suppressed. This accumulation of detail creates historical density that invites verification, transforming pulp fiction device into plausible scholarly reference. The cross-referencing strategy proved essential. When Robert E. Howard's The Blackstone, 1931, mentions both the Necronomicon and von Junst's Unaussprechlichen Kulten, readers who had encountered these texts separately in Lovecraft's and Howard's stories found them corroborating each other. Clark Ashton Smith's The Tale of Zatampra Zaros, 1929, introduces the Book of Eibon while referencing the Necronomicon, creating triangulated authentication. No single writer claims comprehensive knowledge. Instead, each story adds fragments, exactly how obscure texts surface in actual scholarship. Mentioned in footnotes here, partially quoted there, gradually establishing presence through distributed citation. Lovecraft also developed differentiation between texts. The Necronomicon focuses on the Old Ones and their terrestrial worship. The Pnakotic Manuscripts document pre-human civilizations and their knowledge. Unaussprechlichen Kulten catalogs global cult practices across history. The Book of Eibon preserves Hyperborean sorcery. Each grimoire offers different perspective on cosmic horrors underlying reality, like geological surveys mapping the same terrain from different methodologies. This specialization prevents the texts from becoming interchangeable, while their occasional overlap creates the impression of independent sources confirming each other's accuracy. The strategic vagueness about contents remains consistent. Lovecraft rarely quotes extensively. We get tantalizing fragments, a ritual incantation here, a cosmic genealogy there, a description of non-Euclidean architecture, but never enough to fully satisfy curiosity or enable reader to mentally reconstruct the complete text. This restraint proves crucial. The grimoires maintain power through partial inaccessibility. Like black holes known primarily through effects on surrounding matter, the books reveal themselves through impact on characters rather than direct quotation. The horror lies not in specific passages, but in accumulated evidence that these passages exist and were written by someone who knew what they described. By the mid-1930s, the Necronomicon had appeared in enough Lovecraft stories, mentioned in enough other writers' tales, and accumulated enough bibliographic detail that it possessed documentary weight comparable to actual obscure texts. Readers encountering it for the first time in a new story brought accumulated knowledge from previous encounters, creating intertextual density where each appearance reinforced all others. The shared universe functioned, creating through distributed authorship the impression that these grimoires existed independent of any single writer's imagination. They were being discovered, not invented. The Dunwich Horror, 1928, demonstrates the Necronomicon's full narrative potential as both plot device and thematic embodiment of forbidden knowledge's consequences. The story centers on Wilbur Whately, a precocious and physically abnormal youth from rural Massachusetts who grows to adult height by age 10 and develops increasingly non-human features. His desperate quest to access Miskatonic University's restricted copy of the Necronomicon drives the narrative toward its revelation. Whately is hybrid offspring of his human mother and Yog-Sothoth, conceived through rituals his grandfather performed using procedures documented in that very grimoire. Miskatonic University's library becomes crucial setting. Lovecraft describes the restricted collection in meticulous detail, locked cases requiring special permission to access, climate-controlled storage, cataloging system designed to discourage casual browsing. The Necronomicon occupies pride of place among these dangerous texts. A Latin edition by Olaus Wormius, one of perhaps 5 surviving copies worldwide. Dr. Henry Armitage, the head librarian, understands his institution's dual responsibility, preserving texts of historical and scholarly value while preventing their misuse. This creates institutional tension that mirrors the larger epistemological questions. Should knowledge be accessible regardless of danger? Can scholars trusted to handle information responsibly? The story answers pessimistically. Whately's initial request appears legitimate. He presents himself as independent scholar, researching New England folklore, specifically pre-colonial belief systems that might inform his understanding of regional cultural development. Armitage grants supervised access. Whately spends hours copying passages, focusing particularly on sections describing Yog-Sothoth and the rituals for opening dimensional gates. His annotations reveal disturbing comprehension. He's not studying the text as historical curiosity, but as operational manual. When Armitage discovers Whately has annotated his copied passages with mathematical calculations and astronomical observations, he revokes access. This denial proves fatal. Whately attempts to steal the book, dies in the library when guard dogs attack him, and his death reveals his true nature. The description of Whately's corpse deserves attention. Lovecraft details a body that appeared human when clothed, but proves monstrously hybrid beneath. Above the waist, it was semi-anthropomorphic, though its chest had the leathery, reticulated hide of a crocodile or alligator. The back was piebald with yellow and black. Below the waist, though, it was the worst, for here all human resemblance left off, and sheer fantasy began. passage continues, describing tentacles, rudimentary mouths, and eyes arranged in non-bilateral symmetry. This physical transformation literalizes the conceptual transformation the grimoire produces. Whately's deep engagement with the Necronomicon didn't corrupt human form through supernatural curse. It educated him into his actual hybrid nature, allowing expression of characteristics his human appearance had suppressed. Dr. Armitage's subsequent investigation requires him to read the very passages he had protected. He discovers that Whately's notes reference specific Necronomicon sections about summoning the Old Ones and opening gates between dimensions. One fragment Lovecraft quotes directly, "Yog-Sothoth knows the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the key and guardian of the gate. Past, present, future, all are one in Yog-Sothoth." The passage collapses temporal distinctions, suggesting entity that exists across all moments simultaneously. Armitage recognizes that Whately wasn't attempting random sorcery, but following precise protocols for dimensional transgression documented in the text. The horror escalates when Armitage realizes Whately had a twin brother, something invisible and enormous, kept hidden in the family farmhouse, now loose and growing larger. The Necronomicon provides both explanation and potential solution. The invisible twin represents Yog-Sothoth's direct offspring, barely constrained by physical manifestation in three-dimensional space. Whately needed the complete Necronomicon text to perform rituals that would permanently open dimensional gates, allowing the Old Ones to reclaim Earth. His death interrupted the process, but didn't stop his twin's rampage. Armitage assembles colleagues who help him locate counter-rituals in the Necronomicon itself. This creates fascinating symmetry. The same text that documented the summoning procedures also preserved banishment protocols, suggesting ancient knowledge of both invocation and defense. The final confrontation involves chanting formulas in languages that hurt to pronounce, creating acoustic effects that force the invisible entity into temporary visibility. Witnesses see it briefly. It was a sort of semi-plastic, jelly-like mass, covered with eyes. But the worst thing was the sound it made. It screamed, the hellish chant of the creature, rising and falling like a discordant symphony of 1,000 mocking voices. The description emphasizes wrongness, biological principles violated, geometries that shouldn't exist, sensory assault that exceeds normal perceptual processing. The story demonstrates the Necronomicon's narrative function across multiple dimensions. As plot device, it provides Whately's motivation and Armitage's solution. As thematic element, it embodies the double-edged nature of knowledge, simultaneously dangerous and necessary. As world-building tool, it anchors cosmic horror in documentary form, making the fantastic feel researched rather than invented. The text serves as bridge between human ignorance and cosmic reality, deadly precisely because it accurately describes processes that human civilization depends on not understanding. Armitage's final act, returning the book to its locked case, acknowledges that some knowledge requires containment, that institutional restrictions on information serve legitimate protective function. The Enlightenment ideal of unrestricted inquiry collapses when the inquiry's subject matter includes dimensional gates and entities whose manifestation would end human civilization. The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, written 1927, published posthumously 1941, presents Lovecraft's most extensive treatment of grimoire scholarship as gradual corruption. The novella spans generations, tracing how forbidden texts preserve and transmit dangerous knowledge across centuries, transforming readers into vessels for the very forces they study. Unlike the Dunwich Horror straightforward confrontation, Ward develops slowly, accumulating historical detail until the boundary between past and present collapses entirely. Charles Dexter. Ward begins as conventional antiquarian. A wealthy Providence youth with genealogical interests, he discovers his ancestor, Joseph Curwen, a merchant and alleged sorcerer who lived in colonial Rhode Island, died under suspicious circumstances in 1771, and whose activities generated persistent rumors of necromancy and trafficking with demonic forces. Ward's initial research appears harmless, examining property records, tracking Curwen's business relationships, locating the farmhouse where Curwen supposedly conducted experiments. But his investigation leads inevitably to Curwen's library, preserved in hidden chambers beneath the old farmhouse, and this library contains Lovecraft's most detailed grimoire collection. Lovecraft catalogues Curwen's texts meticulously. The Necronomicon in Latin, extensively annotated in Curwen's hand, Borellis's chemical and alchemical treatises, Trithemius's Steganographia, the manuscript notes of a certain Dr. Checkley regarding essential salts extracted from human remains. Most significantly, Curwen's own journals, hundreds of pages documenting experimental procedures, refinements of techniques found in the grimoires, careful records of successes and failures across decades of research. These journals function as meta-grimoire, showing how a dedicated scholar synthesizes disparate sources into coherent practice. Ward doesn't merely read ancient texts. He follows Curwen's scholarly process, retracing investigations completed 150 years earlier. The transformation proceeds through textual engagement. Ward begins translating Curwen's Latin annotations, discovering that his ancestor had developed procedures for resurrection through careful synthesis of Necronomicon rituals and alchemical processes. The technique involves reducing corpses to essential salts, preserving these salts for decades or centuries, then reconstituting the deceased through specific incantations and chemical procedures. Crucially, the resurrected individuals retain their memories, knowledge, and personality. They're not reanimated corpses, but restored consciousness. Curwen had used this process to interrogate dead sorcerers, wizards, and scholars across history, extracting their knowledge before returning them to salt. Ward's excitement at this discovery drives deeper research. He locates Curwen's salt collection, hundreds of labeled specimens representing individuals from across centuries and continents. He translates the resurrection protocols completely. He obtains necessary chemical compounds. The narrative emphasizes Ward's scholarly rigor. He doesn't proceed recklessly, but methodically, testing procedures, verifying results, advancing cautiously. This makes his eventual fate more disturbing. He's not careless dilettante, but careful researcher who follows sound methodology into catastrophe. The pivotal error comes when Ward decides to resurrect Curwen himself. He reasons that Curwen possessed knowledge of resurrection procedures beyond what the journals document, techniques too dangerous or complex to record in writing. The only way to access this ultimate knowledge is to restore Curwen and question him directly. Ward performs the ritual precisely, following documented procedures. It works. Curwen returns, seemingly willing to share his knowledge with his descendant. They spend months in Curwen's old laboratory, Ward learning techniques, Cohen had mastered through centuries of accumulated scholarship. Dr. Marinus Bicknell Willett, the family physician investigating Ward's deteriorating mental state, discovers the truth too late. Examining correspondence and conducting interviews, Willett realizes that the young man claiming to be Charles Dexter Ward is actually Joseph Cohen, having displaced his descendant entirely. The resurrection didn't merely restore Cohen alongside Ward. It allowed Cohen to occupy Ward's body, using the younger man's identity as cover to resume activities interrupted in 1771. Ward's deep study of Cohen's methods, his careful replication of the sorcerer's thought processes, created conditions permitting this usurpation. Willett's investigation forces him to become scholar himself. To understand what happened, he must read the same texts that corrupted Ward. He accesses Cohen's library, examines the journals, studies the Necronomicon passages Cohen had annotated. This creates recursive horror. Each investigator becomes contaminated by investigating previous contamination. Willett discovers that Cohen belongs to an international network of necromantic scholars who have preserved themselves across centuries through the essential salts technique, periodically resurrecting each other to share knowledge and continue research. They seek what Lovecraft calls the ultimate knowledge, understanding of cosmic forces that preceded human existence and will survive human extinction. The grimoires function here as temporal bridges. The Necronomicon supposedly dates to 730 CE, but documents knowledge far older, rituals from pre-human civilizations, entities that existed before terrestrial life emerged. Cohen's journals from the 1760s synthesized this ancient knowledge with 18th century chemistry. Ward's 1920s research integrates both earlier layers. Each generation adds methodology, while the core content remains constant. Procedures for transgressing boundaries between life and death, past and present, human and inhuman. The texts preserve and transmit this knowledge, independent of individual practitioners, functioning as autonomous repositories that corrupt each reader predictably. The story's ambiguous ending compounds the horror. Willett apparently succeeds in banishing Cohen and restoring Ward, but subtle evidence suggests uncertainty. Has Ward truly returned, or has Cohen learned to imitate his descendant more convincingly? The final phone conversation between Willett and the Ward thing includes slight anachronisms in vocabulary, speech patterns from earlier centuries bleeding through modern diction. This irresolution suggests that deep engagement with the grimoires makes restoration impossible. Once consciousness has been reshaped by forbidden knowledge, no clear boundary remains between researcher and research subject, descendant and ancestor, present and past. The case of Charles Dexter Ward demonstrates grimoires as multi-generational contamination vectors. The texts don't merely contain dangerous information, but actively preserve and propagate it across centuries, selecting from minds capable of processing their contents and transforming those minds in the process. Ward's fate illustrates that scholarly rigor provides no protection. Careful methodology and intellectual honesty accelerate rather than prevent corruption. When applied to knowledge humans evolved specifically to avoid. Lovecraft's death in 1937 didn't end the grimoire's literary life, but transformed it fundamentally. August Derleth, Lovecraft's correspondent and self-appointed literary executor, began producing what he termed posthumous collaborations, stories built from Lovecraft's notes, fragments, and ideas. Derleth also systematized the mythos in ways Lovecraft had deliberately avoided, imposing clear cosmological structure where Lovecraft had maintained productive ambiguity. This included elaborating the grimoire's contents, often explaining precisely what Lovecraft had left mysterious. The Necronomicon in Derleth's hands became more accessible, its rituals more comprehensible, its cosmic framework more organized. Where Lovecraft suggested chaos and indifference, Derleth introduced cosmic warfare between good and evil elder gods, transforming cosmic horror into conventional supernatural conflict. This systematization proved commercially successful, but philosophically reductive. Derleth published guides to the mythos, charts showing relationships between entities, timelines organizing cosmic history into comprehensible sequences. The grimoires lost their epistemological danger, becoming reference texts for a coherent alternate cosmology rather than documents of reality, too alien for human processing. Readers could now understand the Necronomicon's contents without experiencing madness because Derleth had domesticated those contents, translating Lovecraft's suggestions of incomprehensibility into standard fantasy world-building. The transformation reveals tension inherent in collaborative mythology. Each edition either preserves original ambiguity or clarifies it into extinction. The most notorious grimoire hoax emerged in 1977 when Schlangerkraft Inc. published the Simon Necronomicon, claiming to present an authentic ancient text that Lovecraft had somehow learned about. The editor, identified only as Simon, alleged that the book derived from Sumerian sources, blending Mesopotamian mythology with Lovecraft's fiction into purportedly functional ritual manual. Despite obvious fabrication, mixing incompatible mythological systems, inventing etymology, manufacturing manuscript provenance, the Simon Necronomicon found substantial occult audience. Chaos magicians and postmodern practitioners adopted it, arguing that fictional grimoires could function as effectively as historical ones if approached with appropriate psychological investment. This phenomenon illuminates something crucial about the grimoire's cultural power. They had become real not through historical authenticity, but through sustained collective belief and utilization. Occultists performed rituals from the Simon Necronomicon, reported subjective experiences, developed interpretive frameworks, and created communities around these practices. The text achieved functionality through use, demonstrating that grimoires operate psychologically and socially regardless of historical origin. Lovecraft would likely have found this simultaneously vindicating and disturbing. Vindicating because it confirmed text's power to reshape consciousness. Disturbing because it represented precisely the kind of irrational belief his cosmic materialism rejected. Lynn Carter contributed different approach in his Zothic legend cycle stories during the 1970s. Rather than claiming authenticity, Carter openly wrote fiction that expanded Lovecraft's mythology while maintaining its philosophical framework. His stories referenced the grimoires extensively, sometimes providing lengthy quotations that Lovecraft would never have included. Carter's Necronomicon passages describe cosmic history in detail, explain entities' motivations, clarify ritual procedures. This satisfied readers' curiosity about contents, but eliminated the text's mystique. Once you've read extensive quotations explaining exactly what the grimoires contain, they cease being forbidden knowledge and become accessible information. The horror depends on partial inaccessibility. Modern horror fiction has produced numerous inheritors. Ramsey Campbell's Great Old Ones stories reference Lovecraftian grimoires while introducing new texts, the revelations of Glaaki, supposedly channeled by human cultists under psychic influence from a lake-dwelling entity. Campbell preserves Lovecraft's technique of fragmentary quotation and emphasis on reader corruption. Thomas Ligotti's philosophical horror often features characters encountering texts that reveal reality's nightmare qualities, though typically without explicit grimoire framework. These writers understood that the grimoire's power lay not in systematic mythology, but in their function as devices for epistemological horror. The Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, first published in 1981, mechanized the grimoire's psychological effects. Characters who read Mythos tomes lose sanity points, accumulate Cthulhu Mythos knowledge, and risk permanent insanity if exposure exceeds thresholds. The system quantifies what Lovecraft described qualitatively: forbidden knowledge as damage to mental integrity. Game supplements provide extensive grimoire descriptions, study times, sanity costs, specific spells, or rituals each book contains. This creates useful game mechanics, but necessarily reduces mystery. Players can calculate optimal grimoire reading strategies, balancing knowledge gained against sanity lost. The texts become resources to manage rather than incomprehensible horrors to fear. Video games inherited similar approaches. Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, features a forbidden tome that characters read across different historical periods, each reader adding annotations and going progressively mad. Bloodborne fills its nightmare world with eldritch texts that grant insight, which simultaneously reveals hidden truths and destabilizes the player character's grip on reality. These digital adaptations preserve the core concept, knowledge as psychological hazard, while adapting it to interactive media's requirements. Players must choose whether to engage with dangerous texts, experiencing consequences through gameplay mechanics rather than narrative description alone. Academic and fan communities have produced comprehensive grimoire catalogs, wikis, documenting every mention across Lovecraft's stories and subsequent fiction. These resources serve scholarly purposes, but create ironic situation. The grimoire's power derived from their fragmentary, scattered nature, assembled gradually across multiple stories, never fully revealed. Comprehensive catalogs eliminate this discovery process, presenting organized data where Lovecraft offered disorganized clues. Readers can now learn everything textually available about the Necronomicon without reading Lovecraft's actual stories, accessing synthesized information without experiencing the gradual accumulation that made the original texts effective. The trajectory from Lovecraft through Derleth to contemporary adaptations reveals fundamental tension. Each expansion attempts to honor Lovecraft's creation while making it more accessible, but accessibility inherently diminishes the grimoire's power. They worked through strategic withholding. Readers knew the texts existed, knew they contained devastating knowledge, but never accessed that knowledge directly. Subsequent writers faced impossible choice: preserve mystery by adding nothing substantial, or expand contents at cost of demystification. Most chose expansion, satisfying curiosity while eliminating the productive frustration that made Lovecraft's grimoires psychologically effective. The texts became increasingly known and simultaneously less forbidden, their contents catalogued and their danger neutralized through explanation. The persistent belief in the Necronomicon's actual existence represents one of literature's most successful reality-blurring hoaxes. Libraries, began receiving requests for the book during Lovecraft's lifetime, and these requests continue today. Yale University's Banneker Rare Book Library reportedly receives inquiries monthly. The Library of Congress fielded so many requests, they added a standard response to the FAQ system. The Necronomicon is a fictional creation, and no such book exists in their collections. This institutional response paradoxically reinforces the legend. If the book truly didn't exist, why would prestigious libraries need prepared statements denying possession? The hoaxes operate across multiple registers. In 1962, Philip Duchesne listed a Necronomicon in his rare book catalog, Spanish edition, supposedly printed in Barcelona in 1647. The listing provided detailed bibliographic information, price, 2,500, and provenance. The catalog generated numerous purchase inquiries before Duchesne revealed the joke. L. Sprague de Camp published an essay in 1976 claiming to trace the Necronomicon's actual history, identifying it as a translation of a Greek astronomical text misattributed to Arabic origins. The essay appeared scholarly enough that several readers cited it in academic papers before discovering its fictional status. The Simon Necronomicon, 1977, achieved something more disturbing, transitioned from hoax to functional text. Publisher Schlangerkraft claimed the book derived from Sumerian sources, complete with fabricated scholarly apparatus, invented archaeological discoveries, and pseudo-academic introduction. The text mixed genuine Mesopotamian deity names, Tiamat, Marduk, with Lovecraftian inventions, creating hybrid mythology that satisfied neither historical accuracy nor fictional coherence. Yet it sold over 800,000 copies and established itself within certain occult communities as operational grimoire, practitioners reporting results from its rituals regardless of fabricated origins. Online culture amplified these dynamics exponentially. Forums dedicated to tracking supposed Necronomicon sightings collect reports of mysterious books, matching Lovecraft's descriptions found in estate sales, obscure bookstores, or university-restricted collections. Photographs allegedly showing pages in unknown scripts circulate periodically, typically revealed as elaborate props or pages from actual medieval manuscripts misidentified. Wikipedia's Necronomicon entry once had to lock editing due to users repeatedly adding confirmed sightings as if documenting real object. The digital age hasn't diminished belief but provided new platforms for its propagation. The psychological mechanisms driving this persistent belief deserve examination. Why do people want the Necronomicon to be real? Several factors converge. First, the text's fictional presentation includes precisely the authentication markers that verify genuine rare books, specific editions, translation history, institutional custody. This triggers pattern recognition systems evolved to identify reliable information. Second, the grimoire's forbidden status creates scarcity value. Something deliberately suppressed acquires allure beyond its intrinsic content. Third, its existence would validate a romantic worldview, where reality contains hidden layers, where conventional scholarship overlooks genuine cosmic mysteries, where initiation into secret knowledge remains possible. Urban legends have crystallized around used bookstores and estate sales. Stories circulate of mysterious dealers who occasionally stock genuinely dangerous texts, recognizable to those who know what to look for. Certain bindings, specific marginalia, books that feel wrong when handled. These legends merge with broader conspiracy theories about organizations like the Catholic Church or Freemasons supposedly maintaining restricted archives containing books too dangerous for public access. The Necronomicon becomes synecdoche for all forbidden knowledge, its fictional specificity paradoxically making it more credible than vague references to secret texts. Comparison to other believed fictional texts illuminates patterns. The King in Yellow similarly inspired readers to search for the actual play that Chambers only described. The Codex Seraphinianus, 1981, a real book written in invented language depicting impossible biology, gets regularly misidentified as ancient grimoire rather than contemporary art project. Jorge Luis Borges's fictional bibliographies in stories like Tlön, Uqbar, Orbis Tertius generated literary treasure hunts, readers attempting to locate the fabricated encyclopedia volumes he described. These examples suggest a category of texts that readers desire to exist, desire sufficiently strong to generate searching behavior despite rational knowledge of fictionality. The phenomenon reveals something profound about textual culture's power. Books possess authority independent of content through their physical form, institutional custody, and scholarly apparatus. A sufficiently convincing fictional book becomes functionally real in social spaces where people behave as if it exists, requesting it from libraries, citing it in arguments, warning others about its dangers, developing interpretive frameworks for engaging with it. The Necronomicon has achieved this functional reality. It doesn't exist as physical object with the properties Lovecraft described, but it exists as cultural entity that shapes behavior, generates discourse, and structures communities around belief in its significance. The question of whether it's really real becomes less important than recognizing it's real enough to produce measurable effects on the world. The Evil Dead franchise, 1981 present, transformed Lovecraft's grimoire concept into visceral horror cinema. Sam Raimi's Necronomicon Ex Mortis bears only superficial resemblance to Lovecraft's creation. It's bound in human flesh, inked in blood, and contains not cosmic philosophy, but demon-summoning incantations that possess the living. The film series replaces epistemological horror with body horror, trading Lovecraft's intellectual dread for explicitly violent, supernatural mayhem. Yet the core concept persists: a book whose contents should not be spoken aloud, whose very existence threatens those who encounter it, whose knowledge functions as contagion. The franchise's commercial success, spanning multiple films, a television series, and extensive merchandising, demonstrates the grimoire's adaptability across horror subgenres. John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness, 1994, engages more directly with Lovecraft's philosophical framework. The film presents Sutter Kane, a horror novelist whose books allegedly drive readers insane, blurring boundaries between fiction and reality until the protagonist cannot determine which he inhabits. Kane's novels function as the grimoires Lovecraft described, texts that don't create false beliefs, but reveal accurate perceptions of reality's instability. The film suggests that sufficiently popular fiction can rewrite reality. That belief, backed by collective attention, possesses material force. When millions read Kane's books simultaneously, the old ones they describe manifest. This updates Lovecraft's concept for mass media age. Forbidden knowledge doesn't require rare manuscripts in restricted collections when bestsellers can contaminate consciousness globally. The Ninth Gate, 1919, approaches grimoires through bibliophile culture. Roman Polanski's film follows a rare book dealer authenticating 3 surviving copies of a 17th century text supposedly co-authored by Satan himself. The plot emphasizes material textuality, comparing bindings, analyzing paper composition, identifying authentic engravings from later forgeries. This grounds occult horror in actual rare book scholarship's methodologies, showing how authentication procedures create vulnerability. The protagonist's expertise makes him useful to forces he doesn't initially believe exist. His scholarly skills, precisely those that should provide rational distance, draw him deeper into genuinely supernatural conspiracy. The Call of Cthulhu role-playing game mechanized grimoire encounters through its sanity system. Characters possess sanity points, representing mental stability. Reading Mythos tomes costs sanity based on the book's potency and study duration. Simultaneously, characters gain Cthulhu Mythos skill, representing forbidden knowledge accumulated. This creates mechanical tension. Players need knowledge to confront cosmic threats, but acquiring it damages their character's psychological integrity. The game's 7th edition, 2014, refined these mechanics, adding bouts of madness that temporarily disable characters, phobias that persist permanently, and potential for complete psychosis requiring character retirement. The system translates Lovecraft's literary effects into gameplay consequences, making forbidden knowledge genuinely costly rather than mere narrative flavor. Video games extended these mechanics into interactive media. Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, 2002, featured a sanity meter that depleted as players encountered supernatural phenomena or read forbidden texts. Low sanity triggered hallucinations, some affecting the player character, others breaking the fourth wall by simulating television, interference, or fake error messages. The game's central artifact, the Tome of Eternal Darkness, passes through multiple protagonists across different historical periods. Each reader adds annotations, gradually reconstructing cosmic history while descending into madness. The mechanic made players experience textual corruption viscerally. You could choose to read or skip manuscript pages, balancing narrative comprehension against psychological damage. Bloodborne, 2015, embedded grimoire mechanics into environmental storytelling. Players collect madman's knowledge and similar items that increase insight, a stat representing cosmic awareness. Higher insight reveals previously invisible enemies, changes NPC dialogue, and alters reality's appearance, but also increases vulnerability to specific attacks and triggers disturbing visual effects. The game literalizes Lovecraft's suggestion that greater understanding brings greater peril. Players must decide whether cosmic truth justifies increased danger, mechanizing the philosophical question at grimoire's heart. Death metal and black metal bands adopted Lovecraftian grimoire aesthetics extensively. Morbid Angel named albums after invented occult texts. Nile incorporated Necronomicon references into album artwork featuring pseudo-hieroglyphics and fabricated archaeological context. The pairing makes sense. Both Lovecraft's cosmic horror and extreme metal explore transgression, forbidden knowledge, and aesthetic experiences designed to disturb. Album covers frequently simulate ancient manuscript pages, complete with marginalia, staining, and damaged edges. The music becomes sonic grimoire, its lyrics cataloging cosmic entities and ritual procedures, its auditory assault mimicking the sensory overload Lovecraft's characters experience when confronting alien realities. The visual representation problem haunts all adaptations. How do you show the unshowable? Visualize geometries that shouldn't exist. Present texts whose contents drive readers mad. Most films default to elaborate physical props, books bound in unusual materials, pages covered in incomprehensible symbols, ritualistic presentation that suggests danger through aesthetic excess. This necessarily falls short of Lovecraft's literary technique, which maintained horror through strategic omission. Film must show something, but showing dispels mystery. The most effective adaptations recognize this limitation, using glimpses and suggestions rather than extended revelation. The commodification trajectory proves darkly ironic. The Necronomicon now appears on t-shirts, coffee mugs, decorative replicas marketed through mainstream retailers. You can purchase leather-bound collector's editions designed to look ancient and forbidden, displayed on bookshelves as conversation pieces. This transformation from dangerous knowledge to consumer product represents either ultimate domestication or peculiar victory. Lovecraft's grimoires have achieved such cultural penetration that people casually own and display them. Forbidden texts become home decor. Whether this represents horror's defeat through familiarity or the grimoire's successful infiltration of consensus reality remains productively ambiguous. The books Lovecraft imagined as civilization-threatening now sit harmlessly on shelves worldwide, or perhaps they're simply waiting for readers who approach them with sufficient attention to activate their original function. Chaos magic, emerging from British occultism in the 1970s and 1980s, adopted Lovecraftian grimoires as central to its postmodern practice. Practitioners like Peter Carroll and Phil Hine argued that fictional constructs could function as effectively as traditional magical systems if approached with appropriate psychological investment. This belief as tool framework treated the Necronomicon not as historical artifact requiring authentication, but as functional fiction whose efficacy depended on user engagement rather than objective existence. Chaos magicians developed rituals invoking Lovecraftian entities, constructed sigils based on invented mythos symbols, and reported subjective results indistinguishable from traditional occult work. The approach validated Lovecraft's intuition that sufficiently detailed fictional frameworks could reshape consciousness, though in directions he would have considered irrational. This represents profound philosophical shift. Traditional magic distinguished authentic grimoires containing genuine occult knowledge from fraudulent texts containing invented nonsense. Chaos magic collapsed this binary, suggesting effectiveness depends on psychological mechanisms that don't differentiate historical authenticity from convincing fabrication. If the unconscious mind responds to symbolic systems regardless of origin, then Lovecraft's meticulously constructed mythology functions identically to ancient mystery traditions. The Simon Necronomicon's success within these communities demonstrates the principle. Practitioners obtained results they considered meaningful, despite knowing, or because they knew, the text's recent fabrication. Academic literary theory found different uses for Lovecraft's textual inventions. Jorge Luis Borges' scholarship frequently positions Lovecraft alongside the Argentine master as explorer of fictional bibliography's philosophical implications. Both writers understood that invented books could examine questions about truth, reference, and textual authority more effectively than conventional narrative. Umberto Eco's work on semiotics and interpretation references Lovecraft's grimoires as examples of texts that generate meaning through absence, books whose power derives precisely from never being fully present or readable. This positions the Necronomicon within postmodern literary theory, examining how signs function, how readers construct meaning, how textuality shapes reality. The SCP Foundation represents perhaps the most extensive inheritor of Lovecraft's documentary horror style. This collaborative fiction project, originating online in 2007, catalogs fictional anomalous objects, entities, and phenomena using clinical documentation language. The format directly descends from Lovecraft's technique, treating impossible things as subjects for bureaucratic record-keeping, horror emerging from discrepancy between mundane procedural language and reality-violating content. SCP. Entries frequently reference dangerous texts, cognitohazards transmitted through reading, information that damages consciousness through being known. The project has generated thousands of entries across multiple languages, creating distributed Lovecraftian universe through wiki-based collaboration. Philosophy departments discovered Lovecraft's grimoires, useful for thought experiments about information hazards. If certain knowledge genuinely damages the knower, what ethical obligations follow? Should societies restrict access to ideas that reliably produce psychological harm? The discussion connects to contemporary concerns about content moderation, radicalization through online exposure, and memetic hazards. Nick Bostrom's work on existential risk uses Lovecraft-adjacent language discussing information hazards, knowledge that creates danger through its dissemination. The hypothetical Rocco's basilisk thought experiment, which supposedly endangered those who understood it fully, mirrors the Necronomicon's fictional properties so closely that online communities banned discussion to prevent potential harm. Comparative religion studies examined why fictional religions attract genuine believers. The Lovecraft mythos, despite explicitly invented origins, has generated sincere practitioners who treat the old ones as legitimate spiritual entities. Academic analysis suggests several factors. The mythology's comprehensive detail rivals traditional religious cosmologies. Its pessimistic philosophy resonates with those experiencing existential alienation, and its lack of moral demands appeals to post-traditional spiritual seekers. Some practitioners explicitly embrace the fiction, arguing religious systems gain power through use rather than historical validity. Others claim Lovecraft accessed genuine occult knowledge unconsciously, channeling real entities he misattributed to imagination. The concept of hyperstition, fictions that make themselves real through belief and action, emerged partly from engagement with Lovecraft's work. Theorists like Nick Land and the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit examined how ideas circulate and produce material effects, regardless of truth value. The Necronomicon becomes prime example, a completely fictional book that has generated real social movements, influenced actual occult practice, inspired genuine scholarship, and shaped thousands of creative works. Its fictional status hasn't prevented it from producing measurable impact on culture, demonstrating that ideas' reality-shaping power operates independent of their correspondence to pre-existing facts. University courses on Lovecraft proliferated from the 1980s onward, bringing cosmic horror into canonical literary study. These courses examine the grimoires as metafictional devices, comparing Lovecraft's techniques to Borges's fictional encyclopedias, Nabokov's invented texts, and Danielowski's embedded documents. Students analyze how fictional books create verisimilitude, examine the ethics of dangerous knowledge, and consider whether some ideas genuinely shouldn't be disseminated. This academic legitimation normalize serious engagement with cosmic horror, treating Lovecraft's philosophical pessimism and literary techniques as worthy of scholarly attention rather than mere pulp entertainment. The grimoires also influenced information security discourse. Computer scientists discussing malicious code sometimes reference basilisk images or Langford basilisks, hypothetical patterns that could crash human neural architecture, similarly to how certain images crash computer vision systems. This translates Lovecraft's textual hazards into computational terms, suggesting that brains, like computers, might have exploitable vulnerabilities triggered by specific information patterns. The analogy remains speculative, but demonstrates how Lovecraft's fictional concepts provide vocabulary for discussing actual theoretical risks in cognitive science and artificial intelligence. Each subcultural appropriation reveals different facets of the grimoire's continuing relevance. Chaos magicians validate Lovecraft's intuition about fiction's psychological power. Academics explore his innovation in metafictional technique. Online communities extend his documentary horror methods. Philosophers employ his concepts in discussions of genuine information risks. Religious studies, scholars examine why fictional cosmologies attract believers. These diverse engagements suggest the grimoires touched something universal: anxieties about knowledge's double-edged nature, curiosity's potentially destructive force, and the disturbing possibility that some truths might genuinely be better left unknown. The books Lovecraft invented to generate literary horror have become functional tools for examining real questions about consciousness, culture, and the hazards of understanding. The forbidden texts resonate across decades because they articulate a fundamental human ambivalence toward knowledge itself. We simultaneously believe that understanding brings power, enlightenment, and progress, while harboring deep suspicion that some truths might damage rather than liberate. The Enlightenment promised that reason would illuminate reality, dispelling superstition and empowering humanity. Lovecraft's grimoires propose the inverse. Reason rigorously applied might reveal realities that invalidate reason's premises, knowledge that destroys the knower's capacity to benefit from knowing. This tension between epistemic optimism and epistemic dread hasn't resolved in the century since Lovecraft wrote. If anything, it has intensified. Digital age information culture amplifies these dynamics. We navigate environments where information overload is constant, where algorithms determine what knowledge reaches us, where we're perpetually one click from content that might disturb, radicalize, or traumatize. The grimoires provide metaphorical framework for understanding modern information hazards. Extremist ideologies function like textual contagions. Exposure can trigger cascading belief shifts, resistant to rational counterargument. Graphic violence, previously restricted by physical media's limitations, now circulates freely, impossible to unsee once encountered. Certain mathematical or philosophical paradoxes produce genuine cognitive discomfort when deeply contemplated. The Necronomicon's fictional properties increasingly describe actual informational dynamics. Climate science presents perhaps the clearest real-world parallel. The data documenting anthropogenic climate change, ecosystem collapse, and approaching tipping points constitutes knowledge that many find psychologically unbearable. Deep engagement with climate research frequently produces depression, anxiety, and despair, responses that mirror Lovecraft's characters confronting cosmic indifference. The knowledge is accurate, scientifically validated, and potentially civilization-threatening, yet it must be known to have any chance of mitigation. This creates Lovecraftian double-bind. Ignorance guarantees disaster, but knowledge produces paralysis. The grimoires' fictional framework illuminates real epistemological crises where truth and human flourishing conflict. Artificial intelligence safety research has begun employing explicitly Lovecraftian language. Researchers discuss basilisks, information patterns that could damage consciousness through being understood. They examine whether superintelligent AI might reveal truths about consciousness, identity, or reality that humans cannot process without catastrophic psychological consequences. The field takes seriously the possibility that some knowledge genuinely shouldn't be pursued, that intellectual curiosity might lead to discoveries that doom their discoverers. This represents Lovecraft's fiction becoming literal research concern in cutting-edge technology development. The grimoires also speak to trauma structure, traumatic knowledge, awareness of atrocities, personal violations, mortality's inevitability, shares properties with Lovecraft's forbidden texts. Once integrated into consciousness, it cannot be extracted. It restructures how the traumatized person perceives reality, often permanently. It resists linguistic expression, existing as knowledge that exceeds conventional narrative frameworks. It tends to spread through communities, second-hand trauma affecting those who merely learn about original events. The Necronomicon's fictional mechanics mirror trauma's actual psychological dynamics, suggesting Lovecraft intuited something profound about knowledge that damages. Yet the grimoire's persistent appeal reveals something equally important. Humans are drawn to precisely the knowledge they should avoid. We seek spoilers, consume true crime, research existential risks, engage with ideas explicitly labeled dangerous. This compulsion appears paradoxical from survival perspective. Why would organisms evolve to pursue information that damages them? Perhaps because ignorance poses greater risk than knowledge in most evolutionary contexts, or perhaps because human consciousness contains self-destructive drives toward truth, regardless of consequences. The grimoires externalize this internal conflict, making abstract epistemological tension concrete through narrative. The question of whether knowledge can be genuinely forbidden remains unresolved. Liberal democracies typically reject censorship, assuming open information exchange ultimately benefits society despite short-term disruptions. This presumption rests on Enlightenment faith that humans can process any truth rationally and benefit from understanding. Lovecraft's grimoires challenge this assumption, suggesting certain information might be mechanically incompatible with human cognitive architecture, not forbidden by arbitrary authority, but by biological limitation. The suggestion disturbs because it implies reason has bounds, that some realities exceed human capacity for comprehension or integration. Modern memory and information persistence technologies create new dimensions to these questions. The internet ensures that nearly any information once published becomes permanently accessible. There is no longer meaningful distinction between restricted and public knowledge, only differences in ease of discovery. This eliminates the grimoire's traditional protection, physical rarity, institutional custody, deliberate suppression. Everything is potentially one search query away. Yet we still maintain informal taboos around certain knowledge domains, social prohibitions against pursuing specific inquiries, communities that practice voluntary ignorance about topics considered cognitively hazardous. The impulse to restrict dangerous knowledge persists even when technological capacity for restriction has nearly vanished. The grimoires ultimately function as mirrors reflecting our relationship with understanding itself. They ask whether curiosity is virtue or vice, whether enlightenment represents progress or catastrophe, whether consciousness benefits from confronting truths it evolved to avoid. These questions lack definitive answers, which perhaps explains the text's enduring power. They occupy productive uncertainty between competing epistemological visions, the Enlightenment's promise that knowledge liberates versus the pre-modern warning that some wisdom poisons. We keep returning to Lovecraft's forbidden books because we recognize ourselves in his doomed scholars. We, too, pursue knowledge beyond prudent limits, follow intellectual curiosity into disturbing territories, engage with ideas that unsettle more than enlighten. The difference between Lovecraft's characters and contemporary readers lies mainly in Consequence's intensity, not in the fundamental drive. We are all reading grimoires in various forms: texts, datasets, research papers, philosophical treatises that reveal aspects of reality we might be better off not perceiving. The Necronomicon endures not despite its fictionality, but because it captures something psychologically true about knowledge's double nature, simultaneously the highest human achievement and potentially our most dangerous creation. The books cannot be destroyed because they represent questions that cannot be answered, tensions that cannot be resolved, the irreducible ambivalence at the heart of consciousness, seeking to understand itself and the cosmos it temporarily inhabits.